This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Since October 7th, we've seen an explosion of anti-Semitism online, and we've talked about this before on the Full Comment Podcast. Hello, welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host, and today we're going to talk to an expert in how social media platforms are used, harnessed to spread information, spread disinformation, but also to organize. It's something incredible to see that within moments of Hamas launching their terrorist attack on Israel on October 7th, that there were professional-looking posters and images and graphics and messages to be shared, and they were shared around the world. They were shared quickly. This seems like a grassroots effort, but to me, as someone who's been around politics, been around campaigns, it definitely doesn't seem that way, whether we're talking the online world or the protests we're seeing in streets, campuses, and elsewhere. Taylor Cohen-Montemayor is with Cyberwell. It's an organization out of Tel Aviv that deals in the digital world. She has a background in high tech. She has a background in academic research and, as with most Israelis, in the Israeli Defense Forces. She joins me now from Tel Aviv. Thanks for the time, Taylor.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian. Great to be here.
So give us a better sense of what Cyberwell does and why you got it started before we get into how it applies to what's going on now. Give me your elevator pitch on Cyberwell.
Sure. Cyberwell is the first ever open database of online anti-Semitism, monitoring in multiple languages across the major social media platforms. We launched in May 2022 with an added value not only of creating transparency around the issue of online anti-Semitism, but also analyzing how this online anti-Semitism actually violates the community standards or digital policies of the social media platforms themselves. So as I mentioned, we launched in May 2022, and kind of our first proof of concept was when we had that October 2022 Kanye West meltdown when he started attacking the Jewish community online. We were able to create real-time high-level compliance alerts for the social media platforms that we monitor, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Twitter, to really guide their content moderators, but also the platforms themselves on how they could be doing a better job of enforcing their own rules and removing this content at scale. So since we've launched this very high-level digital compliance solution for online anti-Semitism, we've been onboarded as a trusted partner of Meta, so covering Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, and also TikTok. We also shared data directly with X, what was formerly known as Twitter, and Google YouTube. What's unique about Cyberwell, aside from the digital policy compliance piece, is that we're also monitoring in multiple languages. So we're monitoring online anti-Semitism in both English and Arabic.
And so when I say there was an explosion on October 7th, pretty much simultaneous with the invasion, would I be incorrect, or did you notice that as well?
That's absolutely correct. Cyberwell tracked an 86% increase in online anti-Semitism following the October 7th attacks, so nearly a doubling of anti-Semitic content online, with a very clear trend in open calls to violence against Jews and Israelis following the October 7th attacks. Specifically in our Arabic data set, we saw that 61% of the verified anti-Semitic content was open calls to violence against Jews and Israelis, which was a departure from what we were used to seeing in the weeks following, which was kind of more classic anti-Semitism, stereotypes about Jewish power, Jews controlling the media, Jews controlling the government, that's what we were typically seeing. And on October 7th, there was just this very clear shift of open calls to violence and mobilization to action of violence in the streets that was coming from the online spaces. And I think that October 7th was very unique in the sense that it was kind of the instance of the largest level of hijacking of social media platforms by a terrorist group that we have seen to date. Hamas was able to hijack the social media platforms and perpetuate their terrorism far beyond the point of time and space of the attack itself, leaving the entire Israeli society in the grips of psychological terror and many Jews around the world as well. I think it made it very clear that the issue of unbridled social media operations with not effective safety measures and not effective content removal is really a matter of national security.
You say specifically Hamas. Do you believe that Hamas was coordinating this, that they were running a digital war room of sorts?
I think that Hamas leveraged and exploited the vulnerabilities of the social media platforms that didn't even need a war room. Infamously, there were instances of Hamas taking the phones of families whose homes they infiltrated and then subsequently either kidnapped or executed, and actually live streaming that terrorism directly onto the family's personal social media accounts, specifically on Facebook. There was also a lot of live streaming using either Telegram or X specifically, and TikTok. It's not necessary to use a war room when we're all running around with phones that have these social media platforms that are inadequately monitoring violent content online. You don't need a war room to perpetuate your propaganda during a terrorist attack. That's what they proved to everybody. That's how they hijack these social media platforms. And then the echo chamber effect of people who were celebrating this terrorist attack and who were Hamas apologists just perpetuated that even further. What was shocking for us to see is that immediately following this large-scale live streaming of a horrific attack, there was a purposeful October 7th denial campaign that started on October 8th, 10th, and 11th, very quickly, trying to excuse, cover up, or even deny that the horrific events of October 7th took place in the way that they did.
That was, I'm trying to remember the name of the minister within the Hamas government. He was formerly in Russia. It'll come to me in a moment. But he has been described by the Washington Post as the biggest spreader of disinformation on this denialism that the attacks happened, or that the rapes happened, or that certain aspects of the terror attacks happened. And, he was hosted by a group here in Canada named Samadun. They held an online forum with him. Samadun, by the way, I'm sure you're aware of them, but for people that don't, this is an organization that is banned in several countries, but operates here in Canada. Their international organizer is an American woman based in Vancouver. She was just arrested for praising the October 7th attacks in public and praising those who carried out the attacks. So they held an online session with this minister from the Hamas government who has been at the forefront of this. Tell me how these networks, I mean, as you observe it, how do these networks operate are they sharing information? Is it coming from one central place? Are they just all people on the same wavelength who've been involved in issues like boycott, divest, and sanction for so long that it was easy pickings for them to jump in on this?
Right. So the minister actually participated in October 7th denial after the BDS network that you're referring to online already started creating very viral October 7th denial content. So he got to that messaging after they already realized that especially the rape and sexual violence that occurred on October 7th in the hands of Hamas, that was going to backfire on Hamas and it was going to hurt, quote unquote, the Palestinian cause. So they started creating that type of denial content far before the minister actually got there. So they're almost like the Western ear or the Western lens that is gauging how to best package, apologize, and legitimize the actions of October 7th for Hamas. And I do think that it is very connected to just how long they have been involved in the BDS movement. And as you mentioned, and I think it's also the inability of Western governments to really look at the BDS movement for what it was. You mentioned Charlotte Cates in Canada and Semi-Dune. Semi-Dune is connected to the PFLP, which is a designated terror organization. The fact that it's still allowed to operate in Canada is kind of beyond me, both as an Israeli and an American.
It's beyond me as well. And by the way, the Hamas official is Dr. Bassam Naim. That's who Charlotte Case hosted an event with. I'm hoping she's deported and she becomes the Americans' problem now. Your government in the United States can deal with her.
Well, if she's busy apologizing for terrorists, either online or offline, they'll definitely be able to deal with her swiftly.
So you think that a group like Semi-Dune has just been? I mean, they've been running webinars and events calling for the release of so-called political prisoners. They're terrorists. Many of them, there's no question that many of them who they name and profile committed terrorist acts, murders, bombings, all of it. And so they've been involved in this for a long time. They are hardcore. They're beyond just saying, oh, my university should divest itself of investments in Israel. They call for the release of terrorists. So it's just one of the existing networks that jumped in even before Dr. Naim did from Hamas to start pushing the denialism.
Sure. I think what's important to understand, though, and in terms of what's different about the world that we live in today, it really is the way that people have access to information, and specifically through algorithm dissemination machines like the social media platforms. So aside from the DNA or the background of Semi-Dune, if we look at the denial narrative, why is October 7th denial such a potent form of modern anti-Semitism, much like Holocaust revisionism or Holocaust denial, is because the October 7th attacks and any emergent situation, there's new information coming out all of the time. There's also deeply shocking information. I can tell you, as somebody who was involved in vetting and going through some of this content, this very, very graphic content in the first week following the attack, you're almost primed to disbelieve the level of barbarism that occurred on that day. We don't want to believe that level of inhumanity and evil is possible. What's unique about what happens on social media platforms is that they have a built-in algorithm or system that's also meant to draw your attention to conspiracy theories. And the October 7th denial campaign is a conspiracy theory in and of itself, because it's not only saying that, for example, the most popular sub-narrative in the October 7th denial is that sexual violence and rape never occurred. The second most popular is actually to say that Israel did it. Israel was behind the October 7th denial attacks, the October 7th attacks of Hamas. So then the picture that you're painting for somebody who is trying to learn about this situation and wouldn't know better is that there's something larger going on here. There's some kind of conspiracy theory. And I just want to say that denial of October 7th or the Holocaust or any mass atrocity that's committed against Jews purposefully, why is that kind of a framework for anti-Semitic belief? Because you're saying that if October 7th never happens, the subtext is that Jewish life, but more importantly, Jewish death is not important, that the Jews are lying about this specific event, so all Jews are liars. Somebody who believes that conspiracy theory will then say, well, if they're all lying, how is it that we're all speaking about this? Well, because Jews, or in this case, Israel, are actually controlling the media and controlling the world stage. And the reason that they're controlling it is actually to get something out of it. They're meant to profit from this atrocity. In this case, Israel getting U.S. aid and carte blanche to do whatever it wants in Gaza. So you've essentially brought the believer of this conspiracy theory through every station of anti-Semitic thought. And that's why it's such a potent kind of modern conspiracy form of anti-Semitic belief. And what I want to point out is that it's not just that this content exists on social media platforms. Let's look at the level of engagement. In a deep dive that Cyberwall did on October 7th denial, only 300 verified examples within the first month after the October 7th attack reach over 25 million views online. So it's not just that this content is out there, but that it's getting a viral level of exposure, a high level of engagement exposure. And we've seen hesitance on the part of the social media platforms to just come out and say that October 7th denial is prohibited content. Meanwhile, they have digital policies on the books about Holocaust denial. That's prohibited content. Sandy Hook school shooting denial that happened in the United States. That's prohibited content. Rwandan genocide denial. That's prohibited content. Why would you prohibit this content to begin with? Because the truth about what is happening matters. It shapes the way that people perceive the world and how they will be called to action to respond to that. The BDS movement is leveraging the inefficiencies of social media platforms to actually perpetuate the October 7th denial campaign. And recently, given the explosion of the campus mayhem, we've even seen the same accounts that were promoting October 7th denial, which again are civilian accounts, now saying that the perpetrators of calls to terror and violence on the U.S. campuses are actually Zionist agents, that the Jews are lying, that this is actually being orchestrated by them, that Soros is an agent of Israel because he's actually the one who's funding many of these BDS groups. So you're just seeing the same denial narrative now being recycled to also excuse and justify the violence that you're seeing against Jews on college campuses today.
I've covered many protests and in-person violent protests. And one of the things that always happens is I will watch someone throw a Molotov cocktail or a smoke bomb from the protest side, not the police side. And then they will immediately claim, well, that was a false flag. That was an agent provocateur. That was a plant by the police. And it sounds like it's the same tactics that are being used online. But what fascinated me about what you said there on the path that people follow as they get in on denialism is I didn't realize how far of a circle it is, that it brings them around to saying that Israel is doing this just to get carte blanche in Gaza. I mean, I've been joking with several of my Jewish friends that this should blow apart the idea that Jews control the media and control all the information in the world, because if that were the case, you're doing a really bad job about it, and everyone has a laugh. But if you believe that, then you're going to ignore the fact that Jews in Israel are being vilified everywhere and just say that this is part of the plot. Everything becomes part of the plot.
Yes, absolutely. It brings people full circle to really continue to participate in the dehumanization and hostility of Jews. It also adds another level as a conspiracy theory, which is mistrust of governments, institutions, and law enforcement, which is part of the other violent response that we're seeing to the campus mayhem now in the United States. And I want to also say that there are major institutions in the media and traditional media that are also participating in this same October 7th denial and kind of conspiratory response to a horrific terrorist attack. For example, the Israeli government did something that they typically don't do, which was that they were sharing very graphic images of those who were killed on October 7th by Hamas, including 2 incinerated infants who were perceivably decapitated. And they shared that photo with the world, and Al Jazeera immediately tweeted out that this is an AI-generated image. Al Jazeera is one of the most influential Middle Eastern news sources. And we've seen that this same kind of denial, packaging any information coming out about October 7th as a conspiracy theory or as propaganda is a belief now widely held by most of those engaging in anti-Israel demonstrations. Even Susan Sarandon, if she was stopped on the street, and there's a video of this, she says that rape never happened. Okay?
Yeah. Well, when the Israeli government shared those photos of the babies, my friend Ben Shapiro shared it online. And because people know I know Ben, they came to me and I had people who do not watch Al Jazeera, who are sympathetic to Israel, saying to me, why did Shapiro have to share those fake images? Those are AI images.
There you go.
They thought that he was wrong.
Yes, there you go. There you go. Yeah, they thought that he was wrong, but they didn't pull that out of anywhere. They saw that discourse online because it was something that was being shared by widely followed sources. And we've also seen following October 7th that many accounts who are looking to grow their following actually started participating more actively in anti-Israel and anti-Semitic discourse. Jackson Hinkle is one of such accounts who had thousands, maybe 2,000 followers prior to October 7th, started participating and sharing anti-Israel rhetoric, October 7th denial, and blatant anti-Semitism, and has now grown his following to over 2 million. This, again, on a systematic level, should tell us that there's some kind of high level of engagement from this content that's being shared on the algorithms of the social media platforms themselves. So if we look at this, we need to understand that the systems of our social media platforms, which actually make up over half of the worldwide internet activity and are used by under 30-year-olds anywhere between 40 to 100 hours a week, increasingly so as a news source, are major systems of influence, of perception, and also of hate, of normalizing hate. And these systems were not only hijacked by Hamas, but in turn were hijacked by Hamas apologists and anti-Western ideologues to then promote anti-Semitism and overall mistrust and distrust of Western democracies.
All right. I want to dive deeper into where the real problems are when we come back and how this is all being utilized by the spread of these campus protests across North America. But we have to take a quick break, and we'll talk about that when we come back. Talor, one of the things that, you're talking about how widespread social media use is, and yet I still hear other people say, despite the fact that, as you just pointed out, social media traffic is about half of all internet traffic, that it is a news source for younger people, that you've still got people say, well, just ignore it. It's only social media. It doesn't matter. It clearly does.
It absolutely does. As I mentioned, as you mentioned, over half of the worldwide internet activity for under 30-year-olds and increasingly the teenage crowd, these platforms are being used anywhere from 40 to 100 hours a week, and increasingly so as a news source. But more importantly, when you look at such a complex issue like Israel-Palestine conflict, or more specifically, just as Jewish neighbors, we're a small amount of the world population. I think that people are more likely to learn about Jews and Israel on social media than they are likely to meet a Jew in their life. And so in that sense, the way that anti-Semitism is being normalized in our online spaces, and that Israel-rooted anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories are being normalized and platformed by social media platforms and getting high levels of engagement, this can absolutely be the primary source of information on which somebody would learn about a Jew or about Israel for that matter. So they're highly influential platforms. I think that we haven't understood the extent, not only in terms of the way that we're sharing information and our beliefs about our democracies, our values, and our governments, but even psychologically, we haven't understood the extent of what social media is to us as a society, as a humanity. We haven't understood it to the fullest extent. And to be frank with you, I think that the government's hesitance to come in and regulate this in a very systematic way is really hurting us and might hurt us again with the imminent rollout of ChatGPT and generative AI platforms, because these platforms, which are now going to be relied on in the future as major decision-making models, not only on an individual level, but on a banking level, on a consulting level, and even on a government level, they're all being fed by online data. And we know that we're in the midst of a surge in online anti-Semitism. I'm deeply concerned that the ChatGPT-like platforms and generative AI platforms are actually going to be the next major platformer of Jew hatred, but on a decision-making level for their highest institutions.
Well, we saw how poorly the Google generative AI was working when they released it, and people would say, "Show me a founding father for the United States," and it was not showing you George Washington. The Pope was a a South Asian woman. And this was done because of the political bent of people who had set it up. And they had to pull that and say, we need to fix this. Well, imagine that not being fixed and going forward, and not just giving people images, but giving them information that is fundamentally incorrect. That's horrific. I want to ask you which social media platform gives you the most pause for concern. And I'll ask within this context, when did a trip to Israel back in January, I ended up in Jerusalem in the office of Minister Amichai Chikli, who his office had just done a study on social media. It was about to be released while they were there. They shared it with us. And a couple of things that stood out for us. One, he said he's bothered by the anti-Semitism and misinformation on Twitter or X, but that he was particularly worried about TikTok because of its impact on the Gen Z crowd. And their data showed, and perhaps it came from you, half an hour a day on TikTok increases your chance of being an anti-Semite by 17%.
Well, that specific study I'm familiar with, it didn't come from Cyberwell. And I think when people look at social media platforms and addressing many of the social ills that come from social media platforms, it's very easy, even in the anti-Semitism world, to say, give me the worst platform, who's doing the worst job. And I think that that's a mistake, because every social media platform can do much better on fighting online anti-Semitism, and each platform kind of struggles with its own challenges. And I'll be happy to go into a little bit more detail about that. So as I mentioned, we're a trusted partner of both Meta and TikTok. And I want to say openly here that TikTok has actually been one of the most cooperative and transparent platforms to work with. I think that they're a younger platform and they're much more open to actually making changes at the platform to do a better job of fighting online anti-Semitism. That being said, they have something called a very aggressive confirmation bias algorithm. So if you're engaging in anti-Semitic or anti-Israel content on TikTok, you are much more likely to have that suggested to you in a very aggressive and repetitive way than you are on other platforms. If you'll talk to people at TikTok, they may tell you that, TikTok was an entertainment platform. Nobody thought that it was going to the 30-second video or the 1-minute video was going to be used for citizen journalism. But objectively speaking, that's what's being done, right? TikTok behind Twitter, actually, the number of people who cite TikTok as a major news source has doubled in the past 2 years. So we have a very aggressive confirmation bias going on there. And we also have a very large user base of Southeast Asian and a large user base of Muslims. So all of that information is driving the algorithm to suggest more anti-Israel content for sure. On the other hand, as I mentioned, we talked about the October 7th attacks, the live streaming of the execution and kidnapping of a family directly to their personal accounts, that happened on Facebook. If you look at AJC's recent survey of anti-Semitism in America, Facebook is actually the number one platform where Jews report that they're likely to experience online anti-Semitism. And then over on the X or Twitter side of things, when Musk took over the platform in October 2022, he kind of threw out the rule book on best practices for content moderation on the platform. That included doing things like now leaving up more hate speech and misinformation than before, and saying that he's going to do something along the lines of freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach, essentially limiting the amplification or limiting the scope of content that's likely to violate policy. But when Cyberwell takes a look at how that's applied to online anti-Semitism, we see that it's not applied in a systematic way. Specifically on October 7th denial, we saw that there were certain instances of that content being removed or restricted when it was coming from kind of nobody accounts. But the second that the same exact content was amplified by a verified account, it was amplified beyond the amount of users that they had. So it was gaining more traction than the users that they had. So each platform really does come with its own set of challenges. What unites them all is that they could be doing a much better systematic job on it. And the thing is, it's important to remember, and this is why Cyberwell is so important in this space, is that data and technology is really the key to solving this issue. I like to say that Cyberwell is kind of an online anti-Semitism compliance officer for the social media platforms, because we have a deep understanding not only of their policies, but how their teams work and what data they need to actually remove this content at scale. And I have seen improvement. So if we looked at the rates of removal of anti-Semitism from last year, it was at about 25%. Once it was reported by a user account saying, hey, here's anti-Semitism online, please remove it. We've actually seen that number increase in 2023 by 8.3%. So now the average rate of removal across social media platforms, if online anti-Semitism is reported, is 32%, with X actually leading that group at 39% rate of removal. So I do see incremental improvement, but I do believe that resources and technology are the answer to this. Before October 7th, almost all of the social media platforms reduced their content moderators. You have anywhere between 20,000 to 30,000 content moderators, maybe 40,000, that are supposed to be handling all of the toxic content on a given platform. And another thing that's really important for listeners to understand, toxic content doesn't cover misinformation and disinformation. This is something that people don't understand, but they should. When misinformation and disinformation is reported to a social media platform, they're working with third-party fact checkers. So they'll send that information off to a fact checker. Typically, it's a Reuters or an AP-like organization. And that organization is under no obligation to even deal with the misinformation and disinformation that is sent to them. And this is something we ran into with October 7th denial. We were reporting the October 7th denial that we were seeing, and it simply wasn't being picked up by the third-party fact checkers, right? And this is true for any misinformation to disinformation campaign that's anti-democratic. Literally, the platforms aren't even responsible for removing this content themselves.
As someone whose media outlet has been accused of misinformation and disinformation by the government because we criticized their policies and our content was immediately removed, I'm very hesitant on that. And I understand where you're coming from on that. There is also the fact that this can be weaponized. And it was by the Trudeau government didn't like that we reported one of their policies in a way that was less than flattering to them.
Sure.
They had our content downplayed and removed. It's
sure. And I think by the way,
it's dangerous.
And I can definitely hear that criticism, and I can agree that it's dangerous. But actually what you're pointing out is that government intervention on the platforms is what's dangerous, right? So government intervention on the platforms is what's dangerous. And I think that that's a legitimate criticism. I think the way to combat that is really transparent and effective systems that are actually not being done by the government. One of the issues here around the misinformation and disinformation treatment on social media platforms is that it's a black box. So on some level, all of the social media platforms say, oh, we don't touch misinformation and disinformation. That's handled by our third-party fact checkers who are under no obligation to even pick up a misinfo, disinfo report and deal with it. And on the other hand, we do know that social media platforms actually do collaborate with the government on various issues. You pointed out the Trudeau issue. I know that there was the Twitter files incident with Hunter Biden that came out after Musk took over the platform. I really believe that the answer to all of these dangers is really transparent and clear systems and effective regulation that the public is actually very clued into and involved in. But the other thing that I want to mention, and I think that this is an important point when we think about, again, the power of social media in this age, it is important to differentiate between free speech and paid speech, right? So what you pointed out is the government intervening in your free speech because it's your criticism of the government. That's a classic free speech example. But to be frank with you, everything that a user would engage in on a social media platform is paid speech. And by that, I mean, when you're creating content as a user on a social media platform, you're participating in a private commercial company that is charged by an algorithm to make money by getting your attention and giving returns to advertisers. So let's think about it this way. You may defend the rights of Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois, in the 70s in the United States because that's their constitutional right. But you probably wouldn't defend the idea that Nazis should go ahead and then march in Disneyland. Why? because Disneyland is private property and it's a family environment. And I think that's how we need to start thinking about these social media platforms. These social media platforms, over half of the worldwide internet activity, increasingly younger and younger users on the platforms. It is not the same thing and should not be treated the same way as a hate channel or a porn site, right? We're never going to get rid of porn on the internet, but the porn will always stay in one place on the internet. It will be siloed effectively. The same thing needs to happen with misinfo, disinfo, and hate speech on major social media platforms.
You mentioned, when speaking about TikTok, a confirmation bias algorithm, and they're not alone in having that. And as a publisher, we have used that to our advantage at times in building audiences that are interested in specific topics. I want to ask you how something like Biden's letter to America took off, because while that happened on TikTok, I could actually understand, if you understand the strengths and weaknesses of each social media platform as a publisher, which I do, and maybe we're getting too in the weeds for the audience, but I can understand how you could make that take off on all the platforms. But as someone that watches this, I'm sure you were aghast when you saw Osama bin Laden's letter to America take off.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that what's important to understand about the online climate, and this goes not only to the bin Laden's letter to America becoming a viral trend, but even things like there's a Instagram influencer who literally rose to fame on Instagram and TikTok by making pro-Houthi content. We're seeing a very pro-terrorism climate online, literally a romanticization of terrorism and terrorists online that then translates into real action and even protests, for example, on U.S. college campuses. This is something that I think, again, goes to this issue of there needs to be a check on social media platforms, especially when it comes to national security interests. I think the pro-terror climate that we're seeing online is very indicative of that. And just so your listeners know as well, this is kind of, we talk about getting too much in the weeds, but the decisions that happens on these platforms actually affect all of us. So even Meta right now got a recommendation from their oversight board, which is like the Supreme Court of Meta, to start normalizing and allowing for the word shaheed, meaning martyr, to be used as a term of praise in conjunction with a known terror organization or a terrorist. Up until now, Meta has taken the word shaheed, and when that appears next to a known terror organization or terrorist, they have removed it because it's highly likely to be praising terrorism. Comes along a Supreme Court of Meta that has a whole lot of explanation about why shaheed doesn't always mean martyr. It could mean witness. It could mean the name of God in Islam. But what for sure is true is that if it appears next to a terror organization or terrorists, then it's praising that action. And literally, Meta at the end of this month now has to respond to the recommendation to leave that content up. So we're seeing two very bizarre things happen. We have a very clearly pro-terrorist and pro-terrorism climate online that is translating into our streets. Meanwhile, there are politically correct decision makers that are making decisions that are governing these platforms and kind of allowing this pro-terror climate to actually continue. And on the online anti-Semitism side of this, we didn't only see it when it comes to pro-terror content that was calling on, specifically glorifying Abu Ubaidah, who is the spokesperson of Hamas, the Hamas media spokesperson, and having young Gen Zers quote him literally on their TikToks that are, one video is talking about graduation, the next video is quoting Abu Ubaidah.
They wear his image on shirts, on cell phone cases, everything here in Toronto. It's unreal. So all of this content and influence that's going through the social media platforms, to me, it seems like it is manifesting itself in these student protests that have popped up across the United States, now popping up across Canada, in two ways. One, it allows them to organize. Two, you've got a willing and open public that's buying into it. And so the organizers are one thing, but then you've got all these people who are just now open to this idea that they may not have thought about before.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not only open to the idea, again, it's a passionate glorification and heroification of these terrorists, right? Charlotte Cates from Semi-Dune, who we mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, is a fantastic example of that. But it's now iconicizing terror organizations, terror actions, and normalizing them as some kind of resistance or struggle against the man, right? Or struggle against oppression, when in fact, these are radical Islamic terrorists who would like nothing more than to bring the same barbarism and terrorism to Western democracies as well. And that's because they're backed by Iran. They're proxies of Iran who say very openly that this is our ultimate goal: death to Israel, death to America. And death to America is now something that has reached the American streets. It's being openly said at protests in Michigan. Glory to our martyrs is now being said at protests on campus.
Yeah.
So I wish it was just the idea that people may be open. I'm more concerned about the fact that people are passionately engaged around these issues. And when I see these American students who wouldn't know better and who are being arrested by police for unlawful activity, they are in shock. They are in absolute shock that this is happening to them. And the thing that we need to really address kind of going forward, I don't think that we should just leave this event as, oh, this was, a temporary moment of widespread mania and people being really ignorant and stupid. No, these people just had a traumatic emotional moment and they were arrested for going and backing an idea that was a stupid idea. It's up to us as a society, and I think partially to our governments, to have really frank discussions about what happened, and to the universities to actually do some deprogramming. Because what you're seeing is the result of programming and brainwashing between the anti-Semitism in the humanities departments at these campuses and social media platforms. It's the perfect storm, being brainwashed for over a decade. And that's not going to go away, and it's not going to stop with hostility against Jews. And I think that that's really important to pay attention to.
Talor, thank you very much for your time and for the work that you do at Cyberwell.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue, theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Remember, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, wherever you get your podcast. Help us out by giving us a rating, leaving us a review, and telling your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.